Welcome to Gospel Simplicity. My name is Austin, and on this channel we seek to bring simplicity out of theological and historical complexity. Today I'm joined by Dr. Benjamin Laird. He is Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at the School of Divinity at Liberty University. He's the author of multiple books, including Creating the Canon, Composition, Controversy, and the Authority of the New Testament, out from InterVarsity Press. Great book, really enjoyed it. And Dr. Laird, thanks so much for being here today.
Glad to be here.
Well, it is my pleasure to have you here, and we're going to be talking about, this book in the New Testament canon. And kind of to start, when we begin talking about the details of how the Bible came to be, some people get nervous and a little squeamish here and wonder if we're just like a hop, skip, and a jump away from kind of Barth Ehrman or the Da Vinci Code, that this is going to somehow erode our faith. So to kind of give that sense of calm, maybe in a way, or maybe to tell people to be rightly worried, what would you say to those people who are clicking on this video but are wondering, like, is digging into the canon going to be something troubling for me?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think a lot of people are troubled by some of the history of the study of the New Testament canon, and definitely didn't deter me. I've always been interested in historical matters, especially since I took my very first church history class. Ever since that point, I was just very much interested, and especially in early Christian origins, and then later that just kind of morphed into a study of the canon. So it's always been a fascination of me and of mine, and it's been a fascination of a lot of people too. But I don't think that it's anything to be concerned about. In fact, I would say that really the problem isn't the study of history on its own, right? The history of, or the study of history just generally, it's really bad history that's the problem, right? I think that might oversimplify it a little bit, but I think you get the point. I think that when you go back to even the first century, we have the Apostle John and others, they warn us about false teaching, right? And one of the things that the false teachers would often present was the idea that Jesus did not come in human flesh. They make historical observations and historical conclusions that were erroneous. So it isn't as though that history on its own was the problem. It's just that bad history drives people away from the faith, right? It causes us to doubt. It leads to a distorted, diluted understanding of Christian doctrine and the Christian faith. So that is really the problem. And when we think about Christianity, there's no way you can really divorce it from its historical foundations, right? I mean, historically, the church has recognized that certain things happened in certain places at certain times. So it's a faith that recognized the importance of historical events. So that would include, for example, the death and resurrection of Christ, right? Historical events. And, some have tried to, over the years, they've tried to discount the importance of those things. You have, scholars like Rudolf Bultmann, who argues that, the particulars about history, that's really not the important thing. Faith is what's crucial. And, don't worry too much about the details, right? I mean, he's written books that go into a little more depth than that. But, that's kind of the sense that is given by some of these theologians, especially the last century, maybe even 2 centuries, the idea that, the historical issues there, who wrote this book, when it was written, why it was written, whether or not the resurrection actually occurred in this way or that way, that's really not that important. What's really important is that you just, follow Christ's example, hold to his teachings, love others, like Christ loved us, those kind of things. And those things are all important, obviously, the teaching of Christ, but we don't want to separate Christianity from its historical foundation. So that's crucial. So I would just say that there's incredible implications for our understanding of history. And if we get it wrong, then, as I said a minute ago, that's going to lead to a distorted view of the Christian faith. And so we really have every reason, I would say, to dig deep into these issues. And from my own experience, the more I have studied these issues, the more convinced I am in the historical reliability of the Christian faith and of the Gospels and the Christian documents. So I think we're actually on very good footing. And unlike some that we know of, I would say that my study of the history of Christianity and the history of the Bible, it's actually enhanced my faith more than anything else.
I love that. And I appreciate the idea that Christianity, it has this irreducible, historical nature to it. We can't take Christianity away from historical claims. And so if that is going to be the case, we should dive into those things, and they don't have to lead us away from our faith, but can even deepen it. And today we are going to dive pretty deep. I love that you talk about this issue of the canon in your book, but you don't just take this as like a theological or historical question, but you even get into questions that I hadn't seen people explore in such depth in these specific conversations before, talking about things like how is it that people in the first century even wrote documents? Questions we don't think to ask, but actually have a big implication for the study of something like the canon. And so, just to start, how did people write in the first century?
Good open question there. So if I'm not careful, I'll jump right into a lecture here, but I'll try to summarize that very quickly. And in my book, the first chapter does get into some of these issues, but there are large volumes that will get into this in much greater depth in my book. If you want a chapter version, I would say my book is a good place to start. If you want a full-length treatment, I would say maybe start with Harry Gamble's Books and Readers, in the early church. I think that's the title. Or maybe E. Randolph Richards, Paul the Letter Writer. That's another good place to start. But to answer your question concisely, I would say that writing was very common, even though, and this may sound like a contradiction, even though most people did not have the ability to write. And so that, of course, led to a difference of the process was much different than it is for us today. So if I want to write an email, I just go to my office, I open up my laptop, I jot it down, and I send it, and it's over, and it's a pretty straightforward process. In the first century, the majority of people did not have the ability to read or to write. And it's also important to note that reading and writing were not exactly the same thing. Today, we kind of treat them as two sides of the same coin. We might say, well, when did you learn to read and write? But in the first century, there were actually many people who were very educated, like the Apostle Paul. He had no problem reading a text, but writing was actually considered a very technical skill that required advanced training. It was a specialized field, a specialized occupation. And so when most people wrote, say, a typical epistle, what they're going to do is go and they're going to visit a professional scribe, or maybe someone who is well-trained and can do this kind of on a volunteer basis. But people are going to basically go to scribes, and the scribe may have a notebook. In those days, it was like we might describe it as a wax tablet. And this was used for temporary writing. So you would have these wooden slabs, and they would hollow out part of it, and they would fill it with wax. And then they would have a stylus, and they could use that to, write into the wax. And then when they were done with it, they, can kind of gloss it over and smooth it over, I should say. And kind of like an ancient Etch-a-Sketch almost, right? Like we had when we were kids, you shake it there and start again. But these notebooks were used to jot down basic things that you would incorporate into a permanent writing. So you might write down, the basic, kind of like the bullet points, right? If I wanted to, say if I was a speechwriter for the president, he might sit down with me and, explain some of the things he wanted to put in his speech. And I'm just kind of jotting down bullet points of key ingredients on my notebook. Then I'm going to go to my permanent writing. It might be a parchment later on, or earlier, a papyri. And I'm going to compose the writing from scratch, and I'm going to write out a draft of that. And then I'm going to read it back to the individual who wanted me to write this for him, what we might call the author, kind of loosely, right? So there's different ways that this could have been done. Sometimes it's just, here's the basic ingredients I want you to put in the letter. Other times it would have been something more like a word-for-word dictation of a text. We have evidence that actually happened quite a bit in the first and second century. I tend to think that's what Paul did, that he's going to dictate the text to a scribe, and the scribe is going to compose it. And then once the scribe has finished his work, it would either be read back to the individual. In that case, it would be, well, in those cases, the individual may not have the ability to read, so it'd just be read. Other times, an individual may inspect it personally if he has the ability to read. He's going to look it over, and then once he's satisfied with the completed document, he's actually going to sign his name at the very end. This is why we actually have a lot of letters that have survived from the Greco-Roman world, and many of them have a noticeable change of handwriting at the very end of the letter. And that's just because we have the author picking up the pen from the scribe, and he's actually composing the last couple sentences or so, maybe a short greeting, and then his name, his signature. So that would authenticate the work, and then it would be dispatched. So there were actually quite a few people involved. It's not, again, just the private activity of sitting down your laptop and sending off a message in a few seconds, or your text or something. Instead, it would actually involve usually a scribe and then a letter carrier who's going to take that writing to the intended recipients. So that's kind of the short of it. And that's just the case with epistles. We haven't even got into gospels yet. But A lot of times people are surprised just how involved it was to compose these works, the various steps that took part in this process, and all the individuals that played a role. So it was actually much more of a process than it is for us today.
Yeah, and I can only imagine with a gospel it would have been a good bit more difficult. I mean, if we're looking only based on length, Paul's letters, though they may be long for kind of ancient, like Greco-Roman context, they're still much shorter than a gospel. What would be some of the key differences in composing a gospel? This video is brought to you in part by Faithful Counseling. Faithful Counseling is an organization of Christian counselors that exists to help you get the help you need. You can find them by going to faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity. And when you use that link, which you can find in the description down below, you will get 10% off your first month, and they'll pair you up with a licensed mental health counselor in under 48 hours. Once you've been paired up with a counselor, you can reach them via instant message, phone call, video call, and more. I think you will really enjoy this, and I think it could be the first step on your journey to greater mental health. And mental health problems affect all of us, religious, non-religious, old, young, every demographic feels the weight of mental health. But there are resources available, and you don't need to go through this alone, which is why I encourage you to reach out to the amazing people at Faithful Counseling by using that link, faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity, and taking your first step towards healing and wholeness in your mental health.
Yeah, I would say the purposes are much different. So when Paul writes a letter, he's writing to a particular congregation, and a congregation that had particular concerns. Maybe they have theological questions. Maybe there's some kind of dispute within their assembly, within their house church, and he's writing to address that. So we often refer to the epistles as occasional documents. So that is the works like, First Thessalonians, Galatians, especially First Corinthians, Second Corinthians. Paul is writing to address specific concerns in a particular place at a particular time. And the way he would go about that was, well, first he's going to have to acquire information. So how is he going to know about what's happening in Corinth? Or how is he going to know what's happening in Thessalonica? Well, he needs to actually get a letter from them. And we know that this happened quite a bit. We have, for example, the Corinthians referring to their own writings. So they're going to write Paul, and they're going to refer to questions that they have. But also, this happened quite a bit. Paul has a network of associates that he's working with throughout his ministry. And if he wanted to check on a church, he would often send someone like Timothy or Titus to go and see them. So Timothy and Titus are going to go and minister in that church for some time. And then maybe they'll deliver a letter, but they're going to come back and report to Paul how things have transpired. They're going to give him kind of a status update, tell him how the church received the letter, how they received the instruction, who needs to be addressed, what needs to be addressed, what are the 2 or 3 issues they're really struggling with, maybe some of the external threats, things like that. And then Paul's going to craft his letter in response to the information he has about the situation there. Now, the Gospels are less occasional, so that's the key difference. They're not writing to a particular congregation like those in Ephesus or those in Rome. They seem to have a much broader target audience from the very beginning. And so it's not as though there weren't original readers. I think there were, obviously, but I do think they're casting a much broader net, so to speak, a wider target audience. So you don't find the same degree of information about the recipients as you would in Paul's letters. But you're still going to have a long process where the gospel writers are going to have to acquire source material. And scholars have debated a lot about what those sources were. And you have different kind of opinions on that. Some would say that the gospel writers are relying primarily on oral tradition, right? Oral stories that have kind of passed down from person to person, community to community, and they eventually, make their way to the end of the first century or at some point. And then the gospel writers, there's dispute even who they were. The gospel writers are going to compose those based on that oral tradition. And we've seen other societies, right? Other societies have oral tradition that is passed down and then eventually was recorded. It was composed. So the idea of, compositions as a result of oral tradition, that's not, foreign to the New Testament. Others would say, well, you have a literary dependency, and that's a viewpoint many would hold. So you have the later authors, the later gospel writers, maybe the Gospel of John or the traditional viewpoint in scholarship is that Mark wrote first, so it's often thought that Mark might rely on certain traditions, and then Luke and Matthew are going to be very much influenced by Mark's composition. So we have a literary dependency there. So there's literary sources, and there's the debate as to how they're related exactly. What's the exact sequence that the Gospels were written? That some have held over the years. Actually, the majority view has been Matthean authorship. That was the viewpoint in the early church. The common viewpoint today among scholars is Markan priority, that Mark was written first. But there's been debates for a long time as to the chronology of them. And that's important because that will actually relate to our understanding of maybe the sources of the gospel writers, right? And then there's also the question of, well, did they also draw upon other literary sources? Was it just the canonical works, or are they drawing on non-canonical works too? So that's maybe a second source that they may have drawn from. But then thirdly, I would say eyewitness testimony. And that's received a considerable amount of attention, especially the last 20 years. Before that, not as much. But I would say books like Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham has really put this on the radar of a lot of scholars, caused us to remember that in the early church, there was an important emphasis placed on eyewitness testimony. And we also find that many historians, Polybius, for example, put a lot of weight on having eyewitness testimony as the source for your history, not just oral tradition. So they were actually better historians than I think we might realize and give them credit for. We have this idea sometimes that if something is old and ancient, then it must be obsolete and inferior, second rate or something. And today we're much more skilled at research, and we take these things more seriously. But actually in the first century, you find that sources was actually very important. And you can make a credible case, I would argue, that eyewitness testimony was the basis for much of what's in the gospel. So you could argue it's a combination of all these things, and that's probably what most people would do. But you're going to have originally a time period in which the writer, whether it's Matthew, Mark, or Luke, he's acquiring source material. So you're going to have to decide, is that eyewitness testimony? Is it other written gospels? Is it oral tradition? But the sources then are going to be compiled, and then you're going to have the author compose his own fresh work that's influenced and based on those sources. And that's going to be a long process because, as you said, the Gospels are very long. They may not seem like it. The Gospel of John actually ends with, close to the end, it actually ends with the words that, even if the whole heavens could contain, the works of Christ, record those things, we wouldn't even have enough space, right? And so, in a sense, the Gospels are very, very abridged versions of the life and ministry of Christ. They don't go into a lot of details on a lot of things. They just really hit what they believe is crucial. But relatively speaking, the Gospels are very long by first century standards, much longer than, say, the Epistles. So this would have been a very lengthy process, and I think it would have culminated then with a careful review of the material. And just like today, when we compose a work, we want to make sure that it's polished, that it's efficient, well organized, all those things. So there would have been a review process. And something else that's interesting, and it hasn't received a lot of attention in the scholarly world, but I think it's something worth exploring. It was common for literary works to actually be read to a live audience before it was, we could use the word published today, but before it was released to the public, right, for circulation. So before that, scholars would often, or I should say authors would often read their works to a live audience, and they might get suggestions on things that might need tweaking. They might say, well, actually, I think you need to address this a little more. This part was really good, but you just skipped over it, and maybe you could lengthen that a little bit. Or this part seems a little repetitive. Maybe you could leave that part out. Or this part I didn't quite understand. Things of that nature. And so that could have been actually where it started. There's a few clues in Luke's gospel that it's possible anyway that the gospels may have originated in this type of fashion, because we have the reference at the very beginning of Luke's gospel to a Theophilus, refers to this most excellent Theophilus. We don't know anything about this individual other than we have his name there and we have this title, but he must have been someone of means, and just by the way he's addressed. And it's been suggested, and I kind of toy with this idea in the book a little bit, that maybe there was actually a public reading of, say, the Gospel of Luke to a live audience before it was actually released. don't have any historical evidence for this, but knowing what we know about book culture in the first century, it's at least a possibility. But I would say once it's released, you have to get the word out, right? You have to make copies. You can't just go to a printer and queue it up and get the printer running and have an original printing of 2,000 volumes and send them off to ship them off to stores everywhere and sell them online. It doesn't work that way. So each of the Gospels had to be hand produced. So I do think there would have been a network of Christians that would have played a very important role in disseminating the gospel very early. A number of copyists. I think there would likely have been a number of trained scribes who possibly were paid by wealthy Christians or who simply just volunteered their time freely to produce these works, to duplicate them. And it could be, as I suggest in the book, that someone like Theophilus had that type of role, that he possibly funded the mass production, the large production of several books of Luke's gospel from the very beginning. So that's a possibility too. So you have to go from the investigation of the sources to the composition, and then you have publication or the circulation of the writings, and that's another phase too. So there's multiple phases in this, but that's just a very broad kind of picture of how this may have transpired.
Yeah, and for those who are saying, on the one hand, this is really interesting, but then are wondering, I wonder what the import of this. I think one area is particularly interesting here, and that's whether we're talking about the epistles, in which you also mentioned in your book briefly the idea that it's possible, at least, that there is a version that could go to the intended audience, and then one slightly different, perhaps for mass circulation. Or if we're talking about in the Gospels of kind of an early reading, and then maybe some like ancient peer review, if you will, there, it gets this question of the original manuscript, because especially within evangelical circles, there's something of obsession, might be too strong of a word, but it might not be, with this idea of these elusive original manuscripts. Whether it's the Chicago Statement or otherwise, we tie the doctrine of inerrancy often to the original manuscripts, but we don't actually have them. And you add another layer of complexity in your book by saying it might not be as simple as we think to get to a single original manuscript for any given book. Can you talk through why it is that that kind of one original manuscript might be a bit elusive?
Yeah, I just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that everything you've heard about, original manuscripts is wrong and it's all just, erroneous and we need to start again. I have an entirely different way of thinking about it, right? Instead, I'm just arguing that we need to have a more nuanced view of what we mean by this. And I think this comes into focus when we think about how works were published. Kind of go back to, the subject we just discussed with the Gospels and how they would have had to be copied by hand very early. So I think the more we know about book culture, the more informed we'll be as to the process that likely led to their dissemination and how they circulated, things of that nature. So clearly there was one writing that was composed first, right? Unless you have a scribe who's kind of like an octopus or multiple hands. Maybe he could write with both hands at one time, and he can compose two works at once. That would be very difficult. The only thing I've seen, before, say, electronics, printing press, things like that. I remember going to Monticello, an hour up the road from where I live here in Lynchburg, and Thomas Jefferson actually designed a little system to write letters, and he had this rod that would go over with a separate pen, and when he wrote a letter, it would actually write a copy, right? So it would produce a copy as he wrote by hand. So I don't think we have something like that in the first century. I think that most likely, about 100% chance, you're going to have a scribe compose the first work. But what I don't think happened was that you have this one, original that gets kind of, sent off somewhere and arrives at, hundreds of miles down the road in some church, and it gets kind of tucked away. And, then 30, 40 years later, it's discovered and someone says, what is this? I don't know. Well, actually, it looks like remember that Paul? Yeah, I think it might, be him, be one of his writings. And then it just kind of goes from there. And then it starts to, circulate in that little area and kind of grow from there. I think what likely happened was you have multiple copies of the manuscripts actually produced at the end of the compositional process. So you don't have just this one that's sitting around for years and years and years, and every now and then someone comes and takes a copy of it, makes a copy. Instead, you would have had multiple copies produced at the very beginning. When I say beginning, I don't mean, within a year or two. I mean at the time of the composition, completion there. So in the book, I give an example. I talk about the epistle to the Romans. We know that Romans was produced in the city of Corinth. And we have some interesting clues in the text itself, in the New Testament. We know that he was actually staying in the home of a Gaius, an individual named Gaius. He mentions the hospitality of Gaius. So he's staying in someone's home. That was Paul's custom, it seems, when he ministered in a certain city. And he has a scribe that he's working with. And the scribe actually identifies himself by name in chapter 16. His name is Tersus, Mr. 3. So Tersus is there, Gaius is there. They know Paul is composing this work. So Paul's not ministering in Corinth, and then he just goes back to his own, apartment, his own, cottage or something, and or he goes to the library and kind of cranks this out on his own and independently, then just kind of puts it in the mail. And, lo and behold, the Romans received this letter, and the Corinthians didn't know anything about it, right? That's probably not what happened. Instead, as we mentioned a minute ago, writing involved a lot of people. You have a secretary, you have letter carriers. You would have had individuals coming and going from Paul with information about what was happening in cities like Corinth. So this is a team effort. And the word would have been out. It would have been very well understood that Paul was writing, a letter like Romans. It's not just going to do it in an hour one afternoon, right? So it's a long process, involved a lot of people. So the word would have been out that this work called Romans, we call Romans today, was being completed by Paul. And I think they would have naturally been interested in it. So when the letter was actually composed, at the end of the compositional process, I would imagine that a copy would have been made right away for those in Corinth. It makes sense. I can't imagine that a letter, as detailed, as theologically rich, substantive as Romans is just going to, they're just going to yawn and say, well, that's for the church over there. It's none of our business, right? Instead, they're going to be very much inclined to hear what's in that letter. In fact, I think there's a good chance that someone like Paul actually read Romans to the Corinthians before he sent it to Rome, or around the same time that he sent it to Rome. So it's kind of a surprise to a lot of people that the first individuals to actually hear the gospel in some cases, or certain epistles in others, would have not been those that are directly addressed in the text, but those who are actually in the vicinity of the author. So I actually think the Corinthians were exposed to Romans before the Romans were. So you would have had the Corinthians receive a copy, possibly multiple copies. We get the sense that there's multiple house churches in these larger cities like Corinth. So you could have had multiple copies produced right away for the Corinthians. Also, Paul is going to keep a copy. That's important to note too. So ancient authors, when they worked with a scribe, they would often receive a duplicate for their own records. And that is going to be a very important point. Help us to understand, I would say, just where these letters came from, how they were preserved. But Paul's going to have a copy, the Corinthians are going to have a copy, and then another copy is going to be sent to the Romans. So we can talk about an original autograph, but I think it's better to think more of like an original printing, because you're going to have multiple copies produced all around the same time at the end of the compositional process. So I think that helps us to understand a little more of just the process there, and helps account for certain things as well. But that's the broad picture there. My understanding of the autographs.
It is a fascinating process, and things that I think most of us don't consider when we wonder how it is that something like Romans was written. And it does have implications as well for our thoughts on the intended audience, because so many of us are taught in our hermeneutics class to read according to authorial intent, right? And in line with how it would have been received by the original audience, like bearing that in mind. And at times we can make epistles seemingly not speak to anyone but that original audience if we go too far with that notion. We say, well, this was only written for Rome. I don't live in Rome in the first century, therefore it's not for me. But if we think about something like, even then, this letter is being read and disseminated, at least to the church in Corinth and maybe other churches, it can help us kind of tweak that and see that even though these are occasional writings, they can have implications for others as well, and that was kind of baked into the nature of the very writing. I want to pivot.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah, I was going to say, whenever we read, the book is not a hermeneutical book, right? But whenever we read scripture, we want to place ourselves in the first century context, right? Just basic, hermeneutics 101 here. But we want to understand what prompted the author to write in the first place. These are not just written for, someone like Paul didn't just come up with a good idea for a book, right? And approach someone and say, hey, I think this will sell, right? No, they're writing to address specific situations. And so it's always important to ask what prompted the author to write this in the first place? What were the issues that he was addressing? And then within that, you're going to find instruction that has universal relevance. So we get in trouble, I would say, when we interpret scripture by either just ignoring the occasional nature of it, or we treat everything as merely occasional, because you can do that too. You can say, well, these are just, first century documents written for this church or that church, so it doesn't really pertain to me. But on the other hand, like I said, you can make the mistake of treating these as universal documents that are completely detached from their first century foundation. So I think we have to be careful with both of those.
Absolutely. A nice little bonus hermeneutics lesson for everyone in the midst of our history of producing first century manuscripts. Well, I want to pivot a little bit from the production of these manuscripts to the formation of the canon, which I think is going to be a theological question that many of my viewers will have and be interested in. So today, we have a 27-book New Testament canon, and that's the same across all of the major traditions within Christianity. But it's difficult to pinpoint when exactly this 27-book New Testament canon was finalized. So just in brief, and then we'll get into kind of the developments of it. But if you had to kind of put a date or kind of a window on when the New Testament was finalized, when would you say?
Excellent question. So many ways I could answer that. I would say we have to really kind of define and pinpoint what we mean by that key term finalized, right? So if we're referring to finalized in a kind of an official sense or a legal sense, I mean, you could really make the case that it was never finalized, actually, right? Because we do have certain councils that recognize the 27 books. They actually name them. So we can, go to the end of the fourth century, second half of the fourth century, and find councils that actually just list them, enumerate the number of writings or the list of writings. But there's nothing that actually leads us to conclude that it was entirely conclusive, right? Because we still have debates about the authenticity of certain works long after the fourth century, whether some works should be recognized as Pauline or Petrine or Johannine. So we have these different debates about certain books that go on for a long, long time, actually throughout most of church history. You can even say through all of church history, right? Even today, there's certain books that are often disputed. So if you're referring to kind of the completion of the canon in a finalized official sense, in an official or legal sense, I would say it's very difficult to actually make a case for a particular date. So I'd say it's very difficult to, kind of pinpoint one occasion and say, well, this is kind of the watershed moment where everything changed and the canon was finalized. And from this moment on, everyone recognized, these 27 books and no others, right? So we don't really have anything like that. But what we do find is that in the first 3 centuries, there does seem to have been a core group of writings. The basic building blocks of the canon, if you will, were there in place. They were recognized much earlier than the fourth century. So you don't have to wait till the fourth century before the vast majority of Christians are recognizing the fourfold gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're circulating in a single codex together. So they were recognized as a canonical subcollection very early on. You also have the Pauline epistles. In most cases, this would include all 14 writings. That would be the 13 that actually have Paul's name on it. And then the 14th, Hebrews, a writing that circulated exclusively as part of the Pauline letter corpus, never with another collection, never with other writings, always considered a Pauline writing as far as the manuscripts are concerned. So you have a group of Gospels, a group of Pauline writings, you have Acts, you have Revelation recognized very early on. And then actually once you get into later centuries, people had more concerns about it than even in the first few centuries, which is just bizarre. So Revelation, very different than the other 26 as far as the reception goes. But you have those basic building blocks in place. Now, really the kind of last battlefield, right, when it comes to the canon would be what we call today as the Catholic epistles, right? Catholic in the sense of universal, not, the Vatican, papacy, that kind of thing. But early on, fourth century at least, there's a group of writings referred to as the Catholic epistles. And that would include the 7 writings from James through Jude. And so we have 7 writings of James through Jude. We have 7 books of Revelation, letters in Revelation. We have tradition that Paul wrote to 7 churches. So we see that number quite a bit. But those books that were part of the Catholic epistles, a number of them were disputed for longer than, say, the Pauline epistles or the Gospels. So early on, there's pretty good evidence that we have a strong reception for works like First Peter, First John, but Second Peter, some of the, well, maybe Second and Third John, James, Jude, these are not as well received. They don't circulate nearly as widely. And so it takes a bit more time for these 7 to kind of come together, to coalesce into what we might call a subcollection today. But really, when the 7 Catholic epistles began to circulate more widely as a single unit, that was really the last piece of the puzzle. So when you get to the 4th century, I would say you don't have the canon finalized in the sense that there's 100% universal agreement and nobody disputed that. But what you do have is the last kind of battleground, the Catholic epistles, that kind of finalizes in a sense, because these writings come together into one unit and begin to circulate. And from there, we have these canonical subcollections that begin to circulate very widely and often together. So 4th century is pretty important, but I would say it wasn't a very innovative time. That's where people, I think, miss the point here, because, as I said, in the first 3 centuries, they're still reading the same books they're reading in the 4th and the 5th and the 6th centuries, right? So no one just came away from a council or something and said, actually, we got to read these books now and put all these aside. We find that the same reading habits in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century continued on into the 4th, 5th, and 6th century as well. So I'm afraid I can't give you a specific date, but 4th century would be the time that you do have a great consensus. I think consensus is a good word. A great consensus, widespread recognition in the 27.
That's helpful. And the councils there are an important part of this conversation because they're often pointed to by very disparate groups as a key moment in the formation of the canon. And you point this out in your book. So on the one hand, you'll have some critical scholars like Barth Ehrman pointing to those 4th century councils as creating the canon in the sense that they were solving their theological battles by deciding what was in and what was out. And you'll see claims that there are all of these other gospels, there are all of these other books, and the best way to kind of squash those theological positions was to say, those aren't scripture. Talk to me a little bit about why that argument falls short.
Well, you can imagine being in a class, right? You take a freshman religion class and you go into, your state university, UNC or something, and you hear this kind of thing presented. It actually makes a lot of logical sense. The position you just kind of described that Ehrman would present. And it makes a lot of logical sense. I would just say it doesn't have a very strong historical foundation. That's the minor problem here, right? But it makes logical sense because if you have, say, one book and it presents Jesus one way, another book, it presents Jesus an entirely different way. One book presents Jesus more as a human, the other presents him more as a divine figure who maybe appeared in human form but wasn't entirely human or human at all. Right? So these different portrayals of Jesus in these different books, you would think that in order to solve the Christological debates that were really heating up in, say, the 4th century, you would have to have maybe a council or maybe a group of theologians kind of decide for the church what we're going to accept, right? That we're just going to affirm these books. And once they affirm the books that were to be recognized as canonical, in this case, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, once that was established, then Christology kind of worked out, right? They were able to kind of decide on some of those controversial issues. And you have, heresies like Docetism or the Gnostic sects or Arianism. All those things go by the wayside because they can't actually hold up to, the teaching of the Gospels. The problem is, as I said a few minutes ago, you have evidence that they're reading the 4 Gospels long before the 4th century. They're recognizing this as a unit. They're reading these 4 Gospels widely. So we don't have any sense that it's just kind of this free-for-all where there's no consensus on which Gospels are to be read and viewed as authoritative. They gravitated to those 4 very early. In fact, I would say by the 2nd century, they're recognizing these books as the authoritative documents that relate to the life of Christ. So if you want to know who Christ is, you got to go to these 4. That was widely recognized. So it's not as though you have, dozens and dozens of Gospels floating around and there's no consensus on this. And so they are just handcuffed and they can't decide, basic things about Jesus, his nature and his teaching. They can't decide anything because they can't decide on the books. I think they actually had a consensus on the books even before you have Nicaea. So it's not just a matter of choosing books. I think that it actually has to do with interpretation. And so you can actually have disputes about, and this comes as no surprise, right, to us, we know this is true, that you can have disputes, hermeneutical disputes, exegetical disputes about the works that you recognize. So it's not as though you just affirm certain books and then everything falls into place. You have to work through those writings to decide what they actually teach, how they actually present Jesus, and then throw in there some other complications. You have a lot of false teaching going around, and oftentimes you have attempts to kind of mitigate those false teachings. So, as a surprise to a lot of people, one of the greatest concerns in the early church wasn't that we need to protect the divinity of Christ. It was actually the other way around. Many people sought to defend the divinity of Christ at the expense of the humanity of Christ. And so many of the heresies in the first several centuries actually had to do with the denial of the humanity of Christ rather than the divinity. But what we have is, I think, a concern that in the early church that we preserve his humanity, preserve his divinity, and that would often kind of cloud how they understood certain passages. So it's not, again, just a canonical issue. It has to do a lot with interpretation as well. So that would be one thing I would say if someone was persuaded by the argument that you might hear by today by modern scholars like Ehrman, or to go back even further, there was a lexicographer, Greek scholar, church historian Walter Bauer, Bauer, and Bauer articulated something very similar to that we have all these different teachings that are floating around. And it wasn't until the canon was formed, but that was a key instrument in kind of solidifying the church into, I should say, pointing the church towards one doctrinal set of beliefs, having coherence there and reaching a consensus on the nature of Jesus. So I would say that the books that were recognized as canonical were actually recognized long before those Christological disputes really heat up in the 4th century. So that's a key reason why I don't think that the council argument actually works that well. And in addition to that, some are surprised that we don't have actually historical sources that show us that the councils determined or set out to determine for the church universal, what should be the writings that should be accepted. We do have some councils when you get to the second half of the 4th century that will actually enumerate the books that are part of the New Testament, but that is not the same as deciding for the church, right, out of thin air, what should be embraced. What we do have are examples where they may list books that should be read in public worship, and the significance of those really isn't much. It's actually not what is stated, although that is helpful for us just from a historical perspective, but what's also interesting about those is what is left out. And so you have a lot of writings that Christians were reading that are not part of the canon, but those were not widely considered to be, apostolic teaching. And there were questions as to when they should be used, when they should be read, where they should be read. And many of those councils were concerned then with, in the church, what should we read? And so you have an articulation in many cases of the writings that should be read when the church assembles. But again, there's no strong, compelling evidence to conclude that those councils determined for the church what should be read. If it did work out that way, we would expect to see a change in what they were reading. But we don't find examples of churches dropping certain books and picking up others after the results of the council were determined, right? They're not saying, well, we actually were reading these books, but now we should be reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John instead. Let's start reading those. So the best that a council can do is just simply describe what the consensus already is. So the councils didn't actually, create doctrines out of thin air or invent them and then thrust them upon the church, and then everybody had to kind of accept it. They do articulate doctrines that were widely believed up to that point, however, and that's what we find in the councils with regard to the canonical writings. So I see the councils then, the various canons that came from those, not as dictates as to what should be read and or as innovative creations, right? Innovative declarations. But what I do see their value in showing us the consensus of the church at the time. So that's, I think, the best way to understand them.
If we were to do a quick kind of comparison between, say, the Council of Nicaea, in which you have this Arian controversy that's ripping the church apart in a lot of ways, right? Like there's all of this controversy. Of course, the idea of the Trinity and the full humanity and divinity of Christ, like these aren't new things, but the council is settling a contentious issue, or at least doing its best. And kind of Nicaea there. If we were to compare that with something like the Council of Rome, obviously we're talking about like a local council now, and it's giving a list of books. Would you say that they're pretty fundamentally different things in terms of the impact of that? Because I think someone could say, or you hear people say, like the Council of Rome is when the Catholic Church kind of gave the authority to the New Testament in a way. And it sounds like what you're saying is that was more or less a settled issue in the 4th century. I mean, there was some debate around the Catholic epistles, but would you say it's not quite analogous to the same level of tension and controversy that we see at Nicaea? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think Nicaea definitely was a bigger issue than what you might have in Synod of Rome or something with 360. So I think the issues there were very fundamental, right? I mean, you're talking about the doctrine of Christ, the nature of Jesus, right? I mean, that cuts right to the heart of Christian doctrine, and so that was a huge issue that definitely warranted, I would say, the council there. And so the council itself, Nicaea, it didn't create a Christology out of thin air, right? So it's not as though if you look back at the church writings of the 3rd century and the 2nd century, you can't find high Christology. They worship Jesus as the Son of God from the very beginning. They affirmed the resurrection, right? So these same core elements that were affirmed at Nicaea, those are going to be found in the early Christian doctrines as well. The best that a council can do is maybe articulate something a little more fully for us, nuance something a little more carefully or fully. That's about it. But it can't create a consensus if there's not already a consensus. And so Nicaea wasn't just individuals coming and whoever had the greatest power won the day. No, Nicaea demonstrated that the consensus of the church was that Jesus was in fact the Son of God, that he's divine in his being, he wasn't created. And so that was a consensus of the church going back, many, many decades, even back to the 1st century, I would argue. So it wasn't a creation. And then when you get to the second half of the 4th century, the different councils there, they were over a whole host of issues. But I would say they were not, you don't want to say no theology is important. They were all important, but they were on issues that were not as fundamental to the faith, right? Often they would have to do with who had the authority, which church has more authority than another church, who has the right to, appoint a bishop here or, something like that, or, what should actually be done in church worship. What should be the qualifications for deacons? When should Easter be celebrated? Just a lot of policy issues are really at the forefront there. So Nicaea was, again, a crucial event, but even Nicaea didn't change things once and for all. I mean, we have Arianism long after Nicaea, right? So it was definitely a good obstacle, right? If you were an Arian, that wasn't the development you would want, obviously, but it didn't actually end, that heresy once and for all. We actually see fragments of that continue on for some time into the future there.
Yeah, so let's get into the question of the authority of the canon, because while very closely related, the formation and the authority of the canon, they are somewhat separate issues, right? So we could look at the formation of the canon as a historical process of how these books came to be recognized as the canonical work of the New Testament. But then there's also the question of, well, what makes them canonical in the first place? People recognized it for some, but why, and what gives them authority? Okay, so you lay out, essentially, as I read it, 4 different models for understanding the authority of the canon. They are as follows. So the canon is authoritative because we can trust divine providence. Essentially, God led the church to accept these books, or led Christians to accept these, and we trust the providence of God in getting us to those 27. The canon is authoritative by nature of the writings being inspired, and this inspiration is self-authenticating. I think Calvin uses in the Institutes, like, how do you know a white wall is white? Like, it just is. Or how do you know salty food is salty? Like, you taste it. You read these books and you just know they're scripture. So that's kind of the inspired, self-authenticating way. The canon is authoritative because the church has deemed it so. So that would be the model in which you say, hey, these are the books of the New Testament because at Rome or at Trent or whenever we want to say, like the church decided, and that's that. The canon is authoritative, lastly, because the writings derived from the apostolic community. You end up going with option 4. Why?
I go with option 4, but I would stress that I'm not holding the position that the first 3 are wrong, right? First of all, that was very good note taking. Very impressed there. I wish my students, could take notes that efficiently and clearly there, but at least some of them. But yeah, it's not so much a matter of one being right and the other 3 being wrong. It's not like a multiple choice, A, B, C, D. Which one am I? D. It's really for me a matter of emphasis, because I do think you can make a case for providence. I think you can make a case for inspiration. I hold to inspiration. I think it's crucial. I think it's very important. So I'm not denying inspiration. I'm not denying providence. I'm not denying the church's role in the process in some way or some fashion. But what I do think is that over time, there's been a de-emphasis on apostolic authority. So what I'm trying to do is help us to understand how apostolic authority relates theologically to our understanding of the canon, but also how it relates historically to the formation of the canon. I would argue that apostolicity is that kind of foundational piece that really helps us to understand the rest of the many of other subjects, right? So once you understand that the early church gravitated towards the apostolic writings, that's going to explain why we have certain books in our canon. So why do we have a book like Second John and not First Clement or Second Clement or Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, something like that, or the Ignatian letters? I mean, a lot of those writings are very rich theologically. You could even make the case that they're more theologically, they're richer in their theology and in what they discuss than Second John, right, or Third John or something. So not to belittle Second or Third John, just to say it's a very brief letter there. And you can make the case that if we were just looking at the content of these writings, the church might say, well, let's actually go with First John, or I should say First Clement or Second Clement here. So why is it that they gravitated towards certain writings? Well, I would argue it's because of their apostolic authority. There was a natural proclivity in the early church to be drawn towards those apostolic writings. So I think apostolicity explains why certain books the Christians gravitated towards and why they were selected, why they were recognized, why they are part of our canon today. But also, I would say it's important for understanding the authority of Scripture as well. The works of Scripture are not just, I would say, works like classics, right? They're not just the best of Christian works from the first century. They are apostolic in their nature. So it's not as though we have, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Christian writings, and even throw the patristics in there and say, the first century writings here, these works, these 27 are the best writings there are. And you could argue they're better in certain ways, but that's really not the idea. They are in our New Testament because they are apostolic in their authority. So it's not like classics that have just over the centuries, they won awards for being the best books and Christians just like them the most. And so we're going to go with those. Instead, they bear apostolic authority. So their apostolic origin is very, very important. That explains not only why works were selected, but then their authority today. So you might say, well, providence and inspiration, things like that are important. Well, let's just think about the implications of this. If you argue that the works in the New Testament are, we have these 27 because of divine providence, and we focus on that alone, then the problem is we are not answering all the historical questions and even the theological questions about the canon, right? How do we know that these works are authoritative? Well, you might say, well, God in his divine providence, he just selected certain books, and the process might be a little messy, but we get to what we get to at the end of the day or the end of the church age, whatever, because those are the books that God intended for us to have. And for me, being curious, and a lot of us are just curious about these things, I would say it's not a very satisfying way to look at it because it actually doesn't account for the process itself, right? Or it also doesn't explain why some writings are intrinsically more important than others, right? So for me, I want to know that there's something intrinsically that sets these writings apart from other writings. If it's just providence, then you could argue there's nothing actually intrinsically more valuable or different to differentiate them from the non-canonical writings. It's just the stamp of approval at the end of history kind of thing, right? Providence alone. So my understanding is providence just is a kind of a way to overlook a lot of those messy, thorny historical issues that might trouble people. To go back to your question all the way at the beginning of our time together, you mentioned that some might be a little troubled or a little nervous about getting into historical issues, right? And I find that people like that often like the idea of providence being the basis for the canon's authority, because it's in their mind a way to kind of overlook those messy issues. You can kind of leave the scholars to do their thing, and they may have different viewpoints. And whether it's a council or, a theologian said this, or, maybe the church was responding to a certain heresy like Marcion or, Arius or something, none of that really matters. All that matters is what we have, and God in his sovereignty, selected these books. So it's just a way of, it's not a very satisfying historical position, I would say. And then inspiration. Again, I would firmly hold to the doctrine of inspiration. I think that's crucial. I think each of the writings are inspired by the Holy Spirit. Even though there is a human process in this, I think that inspiration is a viewpoint that the early church held, and it's a viewpoint that we need to hold today. But here's the issue. If you divorce inspiration from apostolic origin, from their apostolic roots, then how are you actually to settle the issue of which books should be part of the canon or not, right? Because, well, another way to put the question is, how do we actually know what is inspired writings? And, some scholars that I respect very much have said, well, there's self-authenticating criteria that you can look into, or characteristics that are true for the inspired writings. I would say, yeah, that's going to be true for the inspired writings, but what about the fact that we have a lot of non-canonical works that were very orthodox and actually are very similar in many ways to the canonical writings, right? So I gave you an example a few minutes ago of, Second Clement or First Clement, or Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, things like that. These are very orthodox works. They are edifying. They are substantive. They are theologically rich. All these things, they have these wonderful characteristics. They call us to greater faith and to live a life of devotion to Christ. They elevate Christ. I mean, everything you would want in a writing, they have these things. But why are they not part of our New Testament? And how would we know if they're inspired? And, if they are inspired, why should they not be included? Well, I would say that inspiration and apostolicity go hand in hand. So the works of the apostles were inspired. I would say the apostles are the authoritative spokesman for Christ. They were personally commissioned by Christ to be the eyewitnesses of the resurrection and the life and teaching of Jesus. So they had a certain authority that we don't have today. And I would say their works have a certain authority that the other writings don't have, even writings that might be as helpful as, say, First or Second Clement. So apostolicity and inspiration go hand in hand. And if we just focus on inspiration alone, then we still have some historical issues that are very difficult, I would say, to settle.
That's helpful. I want to clarify one point, and I should have done it in my recap. When we say apostolicity, though, we're expanding that to the apostolic community, correct? Because you could argue that there's books of the New Testament that weren't written. I mean, it's not really an argument, right? Like Luke wasn't an apostle. So what do we mean, just as a quick clarification, when we say apostolic?
Yeah, the challenging part of that question is the word quick, but I'll do the best I can. Yeah, the word apostolicity or apostolic authority, it's understood in very different ways. Now, suppose you have the position that the letters of Paul, right? The 13 letters ascribed to Paul. You have the position that kind of a critical position that half a dozen of these were not actually written by Paul. So you're going to argue that Second Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians, the pastoral epistles, these are inauthentic works. So what do you do then with the question of apostolicity? Well, you would argue that they came from the broader apostolic movement, or apostolicity for you might just simply be an attribute of the teaching of these writings. So that is, it bears teaching, it emphasizes doctrines, elaborates on doctrines in a way that is consistent with Christ and the apostles. So some have, I would argue, kind of watered down the idea of apostolicity to really include anything that's just in agreement with the original apostles. So it doesn't actually have anything to do with, or may not have anything to do with, the origin of the writing. So someone who rejects, say, the pastorals as being Pauline, they could say, well, these are apostolic works, and they would come to that conclusion not because of their conviction that they're authentic works of Paul, but just simply because they're consistent with Paul's teaching, or consistent with the apostles' teaching there. But we use the term different in different ways today. I could describe, for example, a certain teaching as being an apostolic teaching. You might describe the Lord's Supper or communion, or you could say, the doctrine of the Trinity is an apostolic teaching. I'm comfortable with that. But when it comes to the issue of canon, we also need to recognize that the early church recognized the importance of apostolic authorship. They weren't just happy with a writing being consistent with the works of the apostles. They wanted to draw from the works that were actually apostolic. Now, the challenge for us is, who were the apostles? And I do go into this a little bit in the book. I wish I had more time to get into it in more space. But what we see in the early church is that individuals like Paul, as we said a few minutes ago, they worked with a team. Someone like Paul is working with Luke, they're working with Timothy, Titus. Many individuals are assisting them in their ministry. So we actually have a number of individuals that are part of the broader apostolic community. And so each of the books in the New Testament were written by individuals who were either apostles themselves or they were part of the apostolic community. So they're part of they're associates of people like Paul and Peter, right? But they're working hand in hand with the apostles in the apostolic mission. None of the authors were understood historically to come in later generations in the church, right? So they're not recognizing, say, an early second century writing is apostolic because nobody at that point was actually, working hand in hand with the apostles. So they had a slightly broader understanding of what the apostolic community is. We might think of it today just simply as the 12 and Paul, right? But in the early church, they seem to have a wider understanding. That would include individuals like Luke and Mark and Timothy, Titus, people that were part of the apostolic community at that time. So a work like Luke was regarded as apostolic, not because of its author, but because of its close connection to the apostles. It was written by a member of the apostolic community. And then Mark actually was understood to be apostolic, not because Mark was one of the 12, but because he was a very close associate with Peter and Paul. And then even beyond that, the early church was very clear. Many sources would testify that Mark drew from the teaching of Peter. So the source, to get back to the sources of the gospel, the source of Mark was actually the gospel. It was actually the apostle Peter. And so it's apostolic in its roots, even the gospel of Mark there. So I would say we have to understand the apostolic community a little broader than maybe we have in the past. But on the other hand, we need to emphasize apostolic authorship more than we have in the past.
Thank you for that. It was rude to ask for that question quickly, but you did a great job with it. This has been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate your work in this book and as well as in this interview. And if people want to learn more, I'd really encourage them to check out the book. And you've authored another book on this subject as well, I believe. Is this the one you would point people towards if they're new to it, or where would you have them go?
Yeah, if you are just getting started and you want to know more about the New Testament canon, you've never read an introduction book before, this is a good place to go. I also think, that a lot of the topics we get into are topics that are debated by scholars today. So if you want to get kind of caught up on debates and scholarship on the canon, or if you want to just think about some things that haven't been discussed, I hope that the book has actually exposed some kind of overlooked issues and misunderstood issues. So I try to do that too. So I would say this is a good first book to go to. But if you are kind of new, or I should say, if you've studied the canon for some time, maybe you've read this book and you want more, I do have a larger volume that came out from Hendrickson last year. And this is specifically on the Pauline letter corpus. So if you want to understand more about, how Paul's letters came to form one collection, and even questions like the missing letters of Paul, or what do we do with Hebrews and the pastoral epistles? I get into that in great depth. I go through the church fathers, manuscripts, things of that nature. So if you want more on the background of Paul's letters specifically, I would go to the Pauline Corpus in Early Christianity is the name of that. But if you are interested in more of an introductory, shorter volume that's broader in scope, then I would say Creating the Canon is a great resource.
Awesome. I'll have links to both of those in the description. We'll wrap up, as I always do on this channel, with just a quick rapid fire kind of one word, phrase, sentence answers to the final 4 questions. So what has been the most fruitful habit or spiritual discipline in your life?
There have been many, but to give you just one, I would say being with God's people and engaging in theological dialogue.
Outside the Bible, what has been the most impactful book on your life?
This could be the most difficult question you asked me today. I would say a very timely book that came into my life when I was in seminary, first year of seminary, an intro to church history called The Story of Christianity, Gusto Gonzalez.
Yep.
That book really helped me just understand the basic developments that happened in the church over 2,000 years. And really, you could say that much of my academic journey is just going more in depth in some of those things I learned about for the first time in that book.
Those were in my curriculum as well. You're having coffee with your undergrad or early grad school self, and what's one piece of advice you give him for his future in theology?
I would say if you're interested in academics long term, then invest in the study of the languages, right? Hebrew, Greek, Latin, German, whatever you can get your hands on, whatever you can do. But invest in the languages and those types of skills that you will use over your lifetime.
Wonderful. This channel is called Gospel Simplicity, and people often point out that the conversations can be a bit on the complex side. Maybe people will feel that way today. So I like to bring it back at the end to the question of, in a sentence, what is the gospel?
Simply put, the gospel is the good news that the one and only holy God loves sinners and has made salvation possible through the redemptive work of his Son, Jesus Christ.
Dr. Laird, thank you so much for your time. And thanks to all of you that watch this sometime in the future. I don't take your time lightly. Till next time, be on the lookout for more videos. And as always, go out and love God and love others, because truly, above all else, that will change the world. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, first of all, thank you. And second of all, maybe consider hitting subscribe if you haven't already. You spent an hour with us today. I think that might be an indication that this channel might be a place that you would like to see more videos from. And so if you haven't already, I encourage you to hit subscribe and maybe click like on the video down below, or leave a comment letting me know what you thought. Also, if you want to help this channel keep going and growing, you can go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. Thanks to all of my patrons who give so generously each month to help support this channel.